Welcome to the Citizens Planning Academy. Today we have Sharon Grant with us to talk about how communities can plan for sustainability. And Sharon is LEED certified for AP and BD+C, which I don't know all of the.
I'm certified. I can work on LEED projects, commercial and residential and neighborhood, existing, new, all that. So.
All kinds of things. And she's been providing green building consulting and education since 2006. I'll let you kind of fill in any other background other than that. And then also remind you that we have these sessions once a month, so the first Wednesday of every month, except for July, which we do the second Wednesday, just because the holiday's in there. So we do have July 11th for our next session with Melinda McGoldrick from the city of Boise to talk about live and energize our neighborhoods. So that should be interesting for everyone in the Treasure Valley. And then if you want the full schedule of our other sessions, they're on our website at idahosmartgrowth.org. So thanks for joining us tonight, and thank you, Sharon. I'll let you get started.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. I don't know if this is too loud for everyone, but I was told this is helpful if anybody's on the phone and for recording.
No, you're all right.
Okay.
Sorry, that's me.
There's always technology, but let's see if this works. Okay. So is it an okay volume? It seems kind of silly to be on a microphone, but I get that it helps the recording. So, okay. So I was asked to talk today about how how a city or a whole community could plan on moving towards sustainability and having a more sustainable future. And so maybe what I'll do is start by giving a little bit more background on why I'm speaking to that. I started out by just looking at a home by home approach and how to green homes. And, I'm proud to say I won a Smart Growth Award for a home about 11 years ago that I worked hard to make very sustainable at the time. That progressed into working on bigger homes and multifamily type projects with lots of units in them. And from there started working on whole portfolios of buildings for groups like Oppenheimer Development, Thornton Oliver Keller, Colliers, and some of the others in town that are big commercial property owners. And as part of that, worked on a competition called Kilowatt Crackdown, which was how do we engage a whole bunch of buildings across Boise in trying to save energy. And so it was one aspect of sustainability to save energy. In fact, this building was involved in the competition. So it was kind of fun to do the walkthroughs of this building and see where the opportunities were. But where that evolved into was someone saying, well, if you're used to working on whole portfolios of buildings on trying to get a more sustainable approach or, energy reduction, water reduction, different aspects of sustainability, what about working with the whole city? So the U.S. Department of Energy ended up giving us some funding, and we are now working with 6 different cities across the nation on how to really become more sustainable. That particular funding is focused on energy reduction and emission reduction, and it focuses on buildings more than other types of operations. So just to kind of give the background of where that is. And I've also been asked to develop sustainability plans for businesses across Boise, and just recently signed a contract to work with 2 school districts in Idaho, so that's going to be exciting to move into that market. And just got hired to work with the city of Ketchum to develop a comprehensive sustainability plan. So we're hoping that little remote area, which is where I live, is going to become more sustainable and more resilient to the risks that are around it, such as wildfire and energy and some of those other things. So with that, I always like to ask for an introduction from the people that are here, so I have an understanding of why you're here. If you're a trained architect, that tells me you're a different audience than if you're a homeowner thinking, what could I do to be active in my community? So I'll just start over here and ask for just a 1 sentence, give me an idea of why you're here, what you do, and what your interest level is.
My name is Deborah Munda, and I'm very involved in our neighborhood, the central neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, generally interested in improving, and also I'm thinking a lot about the future of Boise. What would be good for Boise. I'm thinking about these things.
Did you say Central Edition neighborhood?
Central Rim.
Central Rim. Okay. Okay. Deanna, I'll give you a chance too.
Deanna Smith, I'm a staff person at Idaho Smart Growth. I love all things sustainable, so I'm happy to see what new information I can glean from it.
Okay. Alexandra?
Yeah,
You
I'm
good?
Alexandra, Idaho Smart Growth. So also just interested in ways we can plan and grow smart.
Sharon Matthias, and I live off of Broadway in Boise, and I'm a tree hugger, and am interested for my own information about ways to live more green, housing options in the valley, that sort of thing, but also for engagement when there are opportunities for forum feedback, that sort of thing, how to be part of the process more effectively.
So I'm going to speak on a fairly high level about what I see happening on citywide efforts. And then we'll drill down and drill down and drill down. And I'll let your questions take me as drilled down as you want to go. How's that? Okay.
Jan Voss, I'm the director of the Urban Design Center at the University of Idaho.
I'm Scott Oliver. I'm at Idaho Smart Growth, and I'm a lead accredited professional.
I'm Nikki Drake. I'm with the City of Boise. I'm part of the Energizer Neighborhoods program, who's presenting next week.
I'm Linda Paul, and I live in South Boise Village Neighborhood Association, and I'm just interested in sustainability of our community here as well as globally, and knowledge is power.
My name is Pam Waters. I'm just an interested citizen and just interested to see, I like urban development and how we can make cities more sustainable and hospitable as people move more towards the cities away from rural areas.
Okay.
I'm Elizabeth. I just moved up here from Reno, and I'm hoping to get my master's in planning. To learn.
So some people are thinking a little bit micro level, and some people are thinking a little more planning macro level for community. So I'll try to be somewhere in between and probably a little bit of both. And I'm also going to mention Boise a reasonable amount, but try not to give away anything about the Live District too much. Is that a fair way to approach it?
Hey, yeah, do your thing.
The reason I say that is I was actually a consultant as part of the Department of Energy work, working with the city of Boise on one aspect of sustainability. And so we had a fairly significant role in the energy and emission reduction planning, which factors into the Live effort. So I'll touch on that aspect of it without crossing over too much into the other areas. So today I figured I would talk about, making sure we're all on the same page about sustainability. And I always like to start with a definition and make sure that we're talking the same language and that we have the same idea of what sustainability is. I want to talk about what communities can do. What do cities do to achieve goals? What kind of goals are out there? What's happening globally with cities and communities, and then what communities can't do. So I figure that's a good discussion point to say that there's certain things in Idaho that are very specific to Idaho that put us in a position that we cannot do some of these things to be more sustainable. So then we get into a discussion of, well, what do we do to overcome some of those barriers? So we are going to kind of hit on what can do, what can't do, and then get into a good discussion. So what is sustainability? I threw up these things because I think it's a good starting point. I am going to focus more on energy to start with. We'll have some conversation about water waste. I tie carbon emissions into energy very directly. In my view, the largest thing that we have to do for sustainability is work on emission reduction, period. So how do we do that? So that's kind of my core of sustainability. Based on some recent reading that I've been doing, I keep seeing more and more articles about water is the next oil. And what are we doing to pollute our water systems, in particular the water that's in the oceans and our ocean ecosystems. And I'm now getting quite passionate about the effect of one-time use plastic in our world. So I'm thrilled to see all the water bottles that are around the room, and I'm hoping there's some good consciousness about that as well. So I'm not going to focus on that aspect, but I do think if you look at the tier of sustainability, there's certain things that are more important to do sooner rather than later. And I think the emissions is probably the core one that I focus on the most, as well as looking at the planning that affects emissions. So buildings are the biggest culprit. Buildings by far use the most energy and produce the most emissions, more than the transportation sector. So if we don't address buildings, we've missed a big opportunity. Not to say transportation is not an opportunity, that is also something that needs to be addressed. So I will focus a little bit more on buildings than I do on transportation because of that hierarchy. I'm finding by talking to cities across the nation A lot of people are talking about this triple bottom line. A lot of cities are also starting to move into a quadruple bottom line, which is kind of that people, you know, whether you say it's people, planet, prosperity, they're also throwing in that governance side of it. Are we actually showing good governance to our citizens? So it's an interesting component that I see in the world of cities and communities and counties that I don't see in other aspects of working on sustainability plans. The other big buzzword that's been around for the last few years working with cities, they're all talking resilience. Resilience is the primary thing. And the reason for that is it not only factors in sustainability and emissions and trying to reduce those, it looks at what are the risks. Do we have a huge risk of earthquake, wildfire, flooding, hurricane, volcano? You know, really, how do we think through resilience going into the future? So I touch on that a little bit. To me, that's a core aspect of sustainability. Smart growth principles. So looking at that sense of place and the overall land planning, the diversity of housing and all the different ways that the community comes together. And then also LEAD, which takes all of these things and lumps them together. It looks at whether you have a sustainable site, whether you have linkages to biking, to transportation, public transportation, water conservation, energy conservation, indoor air quality and health. So once you lump all those things together, I feel like that starts to capture a lot of the stuff that's above that. So I'll talk about all these different aspects of defining sustainability. So again, elephant in the room. In my view, it's emissions. And what causes emissions, by and large, is energy. So if we're not changing our energy use, we are not significantly changing our emissions that are going up into the atmosphere. So I start with that. What communities can do? Well, is everyone aware of on a federal level, we've pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord? We are now the only country in the entire world. Syria has signed on, Nicaragua has signed on. And if you look at the effort that went into getting all the countries together to sign that, that is historic to get that kind of agreement globally. And if you've watched some of the movies, you know, like the Inconvenient Truth sequel that came out from Al Gore, it shows the amount of effort that went into, because India was a holdout. And it took incredible negotiation and incredible sharing of technology in the end that a private company didn't have to do, but was willing to do for the greater good of our globe. So to have all that happen, only to see us pull out of it, was a bit disappointing, you know, for anybody that really believes in the value of curbing our emissions and climate protection. So with that said, we saw a trend happen after that. Once the US pulled out, we saw a huge interest from mayors across the United States. Over 400 of them made sure they signed on and renewed their commitment. So what we're seeing is a shift from, you got to think globally because the effect is global. It's our oceans, it's our atmosphere. These are big global things. But where the world, analysis, academics, everybody's starting to look at a level of reasonable attention, which is cities. And cities, by and large, globally, are knocking it out of the park. Cities have the scale to make huge difference. They're community-wide if they can engage their citizens. But I have to say, if you do any research, if you ask on a nation level, I'd love to see policies. I'm not going to expect that right now. But on a local level, we should be able to do whatever policies we need to be more sustainable. But I also see a lot of research that says that individuals in their homes aren't necessarily always doing all the things that should really lead to us being more sustainable, myself included. So taking it all the way down to an individual level sometimes isn't as effective either. But inspiring those individuals through more of a community effort seems to be the sweet spot that's probably going to change our world in a more sustainable direction. The reason I also focus on cities are for these reasons here. The vast majority of population is moving into cities. All the predictions are that by about 2030, which is 12 years away, we will see 2/3 of the world population in cities. We are by no stretch of the imagination building enough housing to accommodate this influx of people to cities. I just saw a BBC report on building half houses. That was one of the solutions that they were coming up with. They're like, we need to build And most people that are moving into cities can't always afford the housing that's there. There's a disconnect between the affordability and the income levels and the housing that is available. So there's a new trend of building half houses that started in some other countries around the world. So they literally build a half house that you have a sufficient kitchen, a bathroom, a couple bedrooms, and a living room. And then the other half of the house has a foundation. It has enough of a wall structure to put a roof on, and that's it. So if sometime in the future that family is able to finish out that house, or if they want to put a business in the other half of that house, it gives them flexibility that they can afford to get in there first and have a place to live that's safe. It may be smaller than they want, but if they expand over time, the logic is that they would have a sellable home or more sellable home at some point in the future. But it gives them more options, and I'm not sure I see that taking over the world, but it was a creative approach that looked like an interesting way to approach housing and making sure that there's enough diversity of it available. Cities and urban areas are responsible for approximately 75% of global emissions, mostly from buildings and transportations. Again, buildings are the bigger hog. Transportation is secondary, but still a big one. In the next 2 decades, an equivalent of 60% of the world's current building stock will be built in lock-in emission patterns for 80 to 120 years. So with all the scientists saying that we need to do something in the next, some say 1 year, some say 5, by and large, that mark is 2030, so 12 years from now. If we're building things to last 80 or 120 years, and they're going to have massive energy use still and emissions coming from that process, then we've missed the boat. We're not planning ahead enough. If you're not aware, residential building codes in our state are now almost a decade behind. So everyone thinks that your home is built to current national standards. It is not in the state of Idaho. And I'll give credit to the city of Boise that they adopted some new building codes that had some more energy efficiency standards. The backlash to that I'm going to hit on later is one of the things cities now can't do. Solutions. I'd like to be positive in how we look at this. I want to recognize some of the mayors that have come together. And it's awesome. These mayors are setting these lofty goals. I met with a city recently that they, by the year 2020, are going to cut their emissions completely. Then I met with their facility staff. Then I met with their sustainability manager. Then I met with their transportation manager. And they were all going, how in the world are we going to do this? So as much as I love that mayors are taking the lead, they're having conferences, they're signing these accords and agreements and committing to these goals, and they're going back to their city councils and they're saying, this is what we're going to do to change our community. We are going to hit these emission reduction targets. We're going to hit these energy reduction targets. We're going to do, I mean, it's wonderful. The problem is that practical connect with the vision that's out there. And does the staff that actually makes all this happen, are they empowered to do it? Are the decision makers that have the purse strings, are they understanding the need and what it really is going to take to get to those goals? So a lot of my role in this world now has become doing that strategic planning to make those connections between recognize wonderful lofty goals and try to sit down and do the nuts and bolts of how do you make it happen. So again, mayors deserve a lot of credit. They are taking the lead right now. According to the World Resources Institute, these are all similar statistics to what I just showed you. So it's really just saying that we've got to address cities. That's where the opportunity is. That's where the emissions are. What they did is they put together 8 actions for urban leaders. These are the areas that they said to work on: building efficiency codes and standards, efficiency improvement targets, performance information and certifications like Energy Star, incentives and finance, government leadership by example. And I think that's probably the biggest one in my opinion. If any government wants to motivate their community to do more and to participate and to follow with any of the initiatives, I think the very first thing that needs to happen is lead by example. And so whenever I coach a city or a school district or a commercial property owner, we start with that leading by example concept. So engage your building owners and everyone else work with utilities. Always have utilities at the table because they can help with the energy reduction efforts, and they usually have incentives. So has anybody here heard of the City Energy Project? Okay. I see 1, 2 people that maybe have heard of it. This was something that was run out of the Institute for Market Transformation. It is just now at the tail end. There are 20 cities that have signed up, 10 of them to start with, 10 more joined in. The funding runs out at the end of this year. We don't know what's going to happen after that, but a lot of it was funded by major donors like the Rockefellers, and some of those big foundations decided to make a real national effort in targeting cities. So the point of this is just that they looked a few years ago and said cities are where it's at. So we're going to do the City Energy Project. These are all the cities that have joined into that. The biggest goal that I see cities trying to achieve, and they must all be saying this at the mayor's conferences, is the buzz about the 2030 challenge. And so the idea is to get to carbon neutral buildings by the year 2030, any new buildings that are being built. Any existing buildings, looking at a 50% reduction trajectory. So when I worked with the city of Boise and said, you're looking to save energy, this is the structure that we established, was based on this idea of you're not going to do everything right away in every building. We worked on a prioritization, and we worked on everybody thinking about this trajectory of going down to that 50% by the year 2030. There's also come out of that 2030 districts. There's now a network of 2030 districts, so Seattle, Cleveland, Los Angeles, et cetera, on down the list. These are all the cities that have signed on to be a 2030 district. So it's similar in concept to the idea of the LIVE district that has been established here in Boise, although this is purely looking at emission reduction. This is about emissions. LIVE district is a broader initiative about sustainability here in Boise in the Central Edition. So beyond the 2030 district, there's also a whole series of cities that have now signed on to be a zero city. It's an initiative run out of the New Buildings Institute, which is an entity that I partner with on a lot of the work that I do. They're all trying to get to 80% reduction by 2050 and carbon neutrality. They're trying to get to where all their municipal buildings are zero energy or offset, renewable offsets up to a certain percentage. So the fun thing about that is that when you walk into a city that's signed on to be a zero city, they're really serious about saving energy to the point where they want to see a net zero building. And so then we look at which buildings are most visible in their portfolio, which ones have the most potential, and then we work to get one down to a net zero building as soon as possible to show the example. So I'll give credit to Boise. I'm not taking the credit, but I'm giving credit to Boise that there are net zero buildings in Boise now. So there's a residential one and a commercial one. And I think just setting that example and showing that it can be done helps people feel like it's more relatable and it could be done in their own homes by the city setting that example. Another thing that has stemmed from all of this is the Department of Energy's Better Buildings Challenge. So there's dozens and dozens of cities that have signed on to save 20% over 10 years, which, to be honest, I feel like that's a start. So if somebody's working on Better Buildings Challenge, my motivation is normally to say to them, well, if you're willing to go further than that, we'll work with you. But it's a really good start to do that, and there's a lot of good support, a lot of good tracking and recognition that helps cities get to that if that's what they commit to. So cities have all these goals. I would say the most widespread one is that 2030 challenge. So they're really looking at emission reductions by 2030, looking at it in their buildings primarily, usually their transportation secondarily. These are the cities that I've worked with. So Boise, Tacoma, Missoula, Eugene, Providence, and Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids is a zero city. They're also in the Better Buildings Challenge. To give a little credit to Michigan, the entire Western Michigan, there's an initiative for a Better Buildings Challenge across the whole western side of the state. So it's pretty cool when you see that kind of inspiration and that kind of motivation to join something like that. That ended up stemming from the U.S. Green Building Council chapter there. So if you're not familiar with USGBC or U.S. Green Building Council, they originally created LEED, the LEED certification that's used on buildings. So We see some interesting initiatives coming out of there, and so it was fun to see in Michigan that one of the things they're doing is a widespread Better Buildings Challenge with about 2 million square feet of building in that challenge. We take them through what we call a strategic energy management process. I'm going to buzz through some of these, but I just want to see or show you that we've developed a process that we talk about engaging the right people, whether it be the internal energy team that's going to make it happen. We like to break down silos. I don't think I'm embarrassing the city of Boise, but giving them a little bit of credibility that when we first started talking with them about fire stations, we had the fire chief in there and he knew all the fire stations, but there was one that sort of was on the outskirts, and that's out at the airport. The airport controlled that one. So making sure the communication happens across silos is pretty important. So when we look at forming an energy team and engaging the right people, we want to go across the normal organizational structure lines and say, how do we create typical, similar types and similar likes that are going to bond people together to try to achieve some of these things and learn from each other. So we work through the idea of setting really good goals. Instead of just having a vision that's 15 years down the road, we try to set really incremental goals. We look at benchmarking. If you don't have a baseline, a metric, and you're not tracking it, how do you know how you're performing? So we work on doing that for all aspects of what an entity is trying to track. We then look at energy use and run diagnostics and try to help them with the prioritization process. Where are the greatest opportunities? When you sit down with a city and they have 200 buildings, most of the time they're not quite sure where to start. They like the idea of saving energy, but if they were to approach city council and say, I want an upgrade and 200 buildings in your budget this year, city council is going to look at them and go, are you crazy? Like, we don't have that kind of funding. We need to plan ahead for this. So what we do is start thinking about how do you make really logical strategic improvements over time to get there. I did a walkthrough of a commercial building in Hyde Park today, and we did the same strategy. I was like, you may not be able to do all of this right away, but if I know this is where you want to get to, then let's talk about how you put together a realistic plan and budget to work your way there with staged improvements. If we want to take that down to a home level, the same thing. Think about where you want to be, what that end goal is, and start an every 1 year goal, a 5 year, and work back from there. We do what we call targeted field analysis, whether it's a deeper energy audit of buildings that really warrant it. So again, we don't really want to pay for audits of every single building in a portfolio if we don't have to. If we pick the ones that warrant it the most, we help with that prioritization. Then we develop a strategic plan, implementation of the different upgrades that we're talking about doing. And then I think one of the most critical factors is the ongoing monitoring. How do we engage people about continuing to communicate about this? Continuing to track performance and know where we stand. So engagement, again, make sure all the right people are there. Where you can be involved is I love to see citizen advisory groups. In Ketchum, I'm going to be working as their sustainability consultant, developing their program. But we've got a really talented sustainability advisory committee, and they're going to guide me and work with me every step of the way. And we're also looking at doing sustainability workshops where we're going to go out to the community and have very active, engaged workshops to say, what does sustainability mean to you? We'll give you the information to say why emissions is important, but if the whole community turns around and says it's about water, then we need to listen. And we're going to do our best to achieve the water goals that are coming in from the community. So I think engaging the right people is very critical. I'm going to skip through goal setting, benchmarking. The only reason I'm going to stop on this one is that the simple act of tracking and benchmarking. They did a study of all the different buildings that are in Portfolio Manager, which is the software they use nationally for commercial buildings. So like any city, when they say, I want to benchmark my buildings, if a large entity decides to, they were able to prove that it was 2 to 3% savings per year just by tracking. So I always like to walk into projects like today and say, so how much are you spending on energy each month? They looked at me and stopped and, I don't know, maybe 300 or maybe 500? Not really sure. So if you don't know what you're spending, I don't know if anybody in this room wants to throw out that they know what their normal electrical use is each month. Sharon, you track it?
I track it, I put it in
Excel spreadsheet.
Okay.
Oh, so geek.
Well, we've also seen studies that if a utility, if all they do is put, here's your energy use for the month, and a smiley face or a frown, that it influences people's behavior. So the simple act of tracking and benchmarking against other entities can be a pretty important thing. One reason I say that is that one of the initiatives that's happening across the country is what's called a disclosure ordinance. And all that means is that there's a disclosure of energy use. If you live in Portland and you sell a house right now, you're going to have to disclose your energy use as part of the sale process. There's over 25 big cities across the United States that have put in mandatory disclosure policies and ordinances. Most of them start with really big buildings and then slowly work their way down. Then they will move over to the residential market. So we're seeing that progression happen all across the country. I think here where it stands right now in Boise, and maybe you can correct me, is it's a voluntary disclosure in the LIV district.
Yeah, I don't have the details for the requirements in the LIV district.
Okay.
Sorry, so.
Yeah, but it's something that, you know, if you go to New York City, you're going to see energy use disclosed in every major commercial building. I had the pleasure of being at a conference with a sustainability manager from New York City about 2 months ago, which I have to say, like in my world, it was like, you know, you're there with the guru. Mm-hmm. Whoever gets hired to be sustainability manager in a city, if they get hired by New York City, you know that he's got it going on. And I would give almost equal credit to the sustainability manager at Washington, D.C., who was also there. And we're in a discussion and they're joking around. And the Washington, D.C. guy, who was Bill Updike, turns around and says to the New York City sustainability manager, well, as long as you do it first, all I have to do is turn around to my mayor and say, well, New York City did it. So what we see is this network of sustainability managers that's come together across the nation. So here in Boise, it's Haley Falconer, and I believe she attends the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And so it's a really active network of sustainability managers that connect across the whole nation. So it's very cool to look at what's happening in the big cities, but it's not always applicable to medium-sized cities or small cities. So we definitely want to think differently about adapting depending on the size and the scale of the city. I will say that the initiative that New York City is working on is to go beyond just a disclosure ordinance. They now took the bottom tier of buildings that are the least energy efficient by sharing their data and said, you now need to go improve it by this much. So that is what's being wrestled with as policy in New York City right as we speak. So that's one way to try to tell your community that they're going to lower their emissions. But I like the idea of starting by leading by example. A city will inspire, show a good example, and then start working on slow, you know, policies that are something that are manageable for the people that live in the community. So we also put it through some analysis. So the reason I show this is we can do virtual energy audits where if you look at the red curve, that's the heating load. If you look at the yellow, that's the cooling load. I was told to stay here at the microphone, but my nature is to be like walking across the room, and so I'm going to try to stay stationary. The yellow is your electric base load. The gray is your thermal base load. Do you see an issue happening between the red and the blue? Do you see that they're overlapping and on top of each other? This is a problem we see in commercial buildings all the time. They are paying to heat simultaneously with paying to cool. So from 55 degrees to about 75 degrees, they are heating and cooling at the same time. So it may not seem like doing a virtual energy audit is like the most valuable thing to do, but if you have to pay a lot to an energy auditor to walk a building, it's kind of nice to have an idea of this before they go in there. So now instead of paying for a full energy audit, the very first thing I'm going to do is say, I just want somebody who knows the building controls system. Go in and figure out how to keep it from heating and cooling at the same time, and that's going to make a huge difference. This is another level of analysis we do. So this is a city that has pools. That lime green area is all their pools. 3 of them are the biggest energy users in their whole city. So where's their opportunity? Purple square. one big square airport terminal. So when we look at a city, it might be nice to pay attention to the fire stations, which is the bottom orange, and the police right above it. But one individual fire station may not be total energy use that is causing a big difference in the portfolio, but it might be really high energy use that's just a huge opportunity. But what we do is we walk in and go, what are your elephants? If you're not paying attention to your airport in this scheme, then we've missed the boat in this particular community. Ketchum, Idaho did some analysis and looked at their total energy use as a community. 88% of the energy came from one operation. Any guess?
Snowmaking.
No, but it's up there.
The lifts?
The ski lifts?
I think it's summer.
Yeah, they don't count the ski lifts, unfortunately. That's private data with Sun Valley Company.
Plowing the roads? No.
Nope.
Because you're saying it's buildings.
Wastewater treatment. And with all the technology now for biodigesters and more efficient variable speed fans and everything else, a lot of times when we walk into cities, it's those big things. How do you turn around wastewater treatment, water purification, airports, the big things? Then we also like to look at things that are just common and typical, like smaller things that are achievable. And for some reason, in city after city after city, it keeps rising up that fire stations are one of those targets. The upgrades are very easy to identify. The energy savings can be significant, and they may not be the biggest energy users in the whole portfolio, but it starts to inspire by a department that they've fixed this building and this building and this building, and it starts to bring a team up that's all working together on one department. And I'm going to give some credit to Boise here. You've been by Fire Station 4 or 8. Fire Station 8, if you knew Overland Road, you know where, let's see, let me think of my roads, Vista, Overland, and Latah. It's right in there in between on Overland. Fire Station 4 and 8 are award-winning stations in the nation. They decided as part of the process of saying, you know, hey, we've got, you know, some goals to reduce energy. What can we do with these new stations? The number one thing that we recommend is set your energy targets. So what we do is base it on an energy use index. It's your energy use by square foot by a year. So you could do it in your home, look at your total kilowatt hours by square foot for the year, and that starts to make it comparable between various homes based on your square footage. So we did that with fire stations, and we came up with a target that if we wanted to comply with the 2030 challenge and achieve that, then we would do a 27 EUI target for fire stations. So both of those stations were built to that target. Here's the fun thing, is the airport got wind of that. And they said, well, we have a fire station out here and we're looking to do a renovation of it. We didn't have a target anywhere near that. What'd you guys do? So they then got their target set to 28 EUI, which is their energy use per square foot per year. So it's that kind of team interaction that I like to see happen, that normally there was a dividing line between those departments. We also do portfolio analysis where we convert that heating and the base load and all that. The really long lines mean that they're using a whole lot of energy on the right. On the left, the really long lines indicate an energy use per square foot. So we're looking at two things. One, we want to get those big elephants in the room, wastewater treatment, swimming pools, airports, anything like that. Then we want to get the ones that are just a really high energy use per square foot that have great opportunity. We like to do comparison spectrums. So see the fire station over there on the left, the green one? That's the very first one that we're going to pay attention to too. And we're going to go to City Council with this graph and say, this is the station that should be upgraded. So just an idea of how we'll do some comparisons. This is to give you an idea that there's a lot of zero energy buildings happening. May not seem like it, but when I was at the Path to Zero conference a few months ago, it was impressive how many people are striving towards this. And it's big entities. It's companies like Apple saying they want an entire storage operation to be renewable energy. Why? Security. Anything happens to our electric grid, they're secure. They will not lose power in any of their operations. So it's big companies like that thinking about saving energy and hitting those emissions targets, not always for the altruistic reasons. We'll be honest that sometimes it is purely down to financial, and sometimes it's down to security and safety. ZNE, zero net energy, efficiency first. So if you're looking to upgrade your home, this is the same thing we would say in a commercial building or a residential home. Start with efficiency first. If you get your energy use down as low as possible, then you can size a smaller system and have a smaller investment of renewable energy. And it is still tough, I'll be honest, in Idaho to be able to justify the renewable energy. We have such low electricity costs that, you know, it's 15, 20-year paybacks when you try to run the numbers. I'm also a little worried about some of the legislation that's out right now with the PUC, the Public Utility Commission. It's looking like some of that structure is going to change in terms of what ratepayers pay who have renewable energy on their homes. Do we have anybody here with solar panels on their home? You're not at risk, but if you're thinking about putting solar panels on, you might be. So this is just to show you, we always like to work through a prioritization when it's a group of buildings with a city. So we put a 1, 2, 3, and a 4-level priority on each building in the portfolio. Then we look at what kind of analysis we can do. We develop a plan. Just wanted to share that one of the things we got tasked with doing was writing a community strategic energy management implementation guide that's applicable across the nation so that cities can pick this up. It is publicly available, and they can reference this on how to develop their own strategic energy management process. This is something that was actually developed as a visual concept in Boise, but I think it's one of the more simple ones that I like. The dark blue line is the trajectory towards getting to a 2030 target. All the other wavy lines are the various buildings in this particular portfolio. So again, we're trying to drive the ones up above down to the target line and the ones below up to it. So what I'd love to see is Boise saying, well, let's look at all the private development that happens. How much of it is up there? How much of it is down there? What kind of things can we offer as an incentive to push those buildings that are high energy users down to the trajectory? What can we do to make sure new buildings are going to be on the trajectory? You know, that would be where like a greater vision that it affects the whole community could come into play. Talked about ongoing monitoring, but we are seeing that lease agreements are changing. We're seeing a lot of dashboards. So if you go out to the library at Bound Crossing, you'll see a dashboard that talks about sustainability and their energy use. So just disclosing, just sharing, having something like that can be really impactful across the community. Beyond buildings, I think that the movement towards electric vehicles is upon us. If you look at the number of major car manufacturers that have said by this year, which in some cases is 5 years away, sometimes 10, sometimes shorter, that we're going to be all electric vehicles within our operations. If you look at the movement towards self-driving vehicles, towards self-driving buses, we're starting to hear a lot about towns that are looking at how do we change our transportation infrastructure to accommodate a series of self-driving buses across the city. So we're thinking ahead a little bit, but I think it's closer than we think. Was sitting down with Idaho Power recently, and they said, absolutely, we've already developed a map of where we need charging stations across the whole state of Idaho to accommodate a network for electric vehicles. And you better believe that they are planning, thinking about if every homeowner starts plugging in an electric vehicle, what does that do to their grid? So thinking about a community level effort as we shift to electric vehicles, I think it could cause, you know, infrastructure changes to the way that our roads are set up, could change significantly the way that we think about transportation and driving and getting around, could also change significantly our entire grid of electricity if we overload it completely and we haven't offset it with some kind of energy efficiency somewhere else. So just thinking ahead about the transportation issue, I believe wholeheartedly in the bike routes and the safe routes to school initiatives that Smart Growth is doing. There's a lot of bike initiatives in this city, and so I love seeing the different nonprofits that are dedicated to it and the kind of attention that's going into making sure there's that kind of bike routes and connectivity. I threw LED streetlights on there because any city I know that is not making that conversion We were just working with one city recently that they were spending $4 million a year on streetlights. $4 million. They switched to LED. In the first year, it dropped to $2 million. 50% reduction. When you're talking a $2 million reduction off of your bottom line, that's huge. If a city does that kind of big initiative, what does that then enable them to do? They can upgrade their own buildings further. Maybe they start putting an incentive out there for homeowners. And I already mentioned the process loads like wastewater treatment that can be such a big factor. We work with a company called Malka on creating really good dashboards and visualizations. So we find that if people just like are told their energy use is something and they're not really shown it in a visual way, we find the visual nature of it can really create more impact. These were some forms that were made up for all the 2030 district cities, and then also some reporting that was put together for better building challenge cities. If you haven't seen Boise's sustainability report, very, very pleased to see that that's published on an annual basis. This is the energy section. So talking about some of their net zero design goals and their 50% energy use reduction in existing buildings by 2030. So the idea is that if the city starts saying, not only did we set that goal, here's how we're progressing towards it. We're already 23% of the way towards that 50%. And then it could inspire the community to feel like, well, wow, if you can save 23%, I bet I can too. What did you do to do that? So then we want to try to engage the private building owners across the city. And the way that that's being done across the nation is disclosure ordinances. And then we're seeing that filter into the residential market, like I mentioned, where it's disclosing energy use on homes as well. This is a picture of Fire Station 8. Just like to give more kudos to the city of Boise for the efforts that were done there. There's an RFP out now to finally build a new fire station in Ketchum. If anybody has toured the fire station in Ketchum, you will be horrified. Mm-hmm. It is embarrassing that that is the condition we put our firefighters in. But it's gone out for RFP, and we are looking at Boise as a model for building two such amazing stations. This is a preview of what you'll see next time with the LIVE initiative that Boise has, which is lasting environments, innovative enterprises, and vibrant communities. I'm going to shift into LEED a little bit. If you're not familiar, it's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a certification that you can get on buildings. These are the LEED categories. So you've got the sites considered, the location and linkages with transportation, energy, water, materials. Are they recycled? Are they local? Are they biodegradable or biomaterials? Indoor environmental quality, the health of the inside spaces that we're living in, as well as some regional priorities. So LEED is in new construction, it is in existing buildings, it's in retail, it's in schools, it's in healthcare, it's in homes. One of the ways I've seen LEED the most prevalent is in affordable housing. So if we start talking about having a more sustainable community, one of the things we have to think about is equity, and we have to think about social equity, we have to think about the diversity of housing choices that we're offering. And so I'm really pleased I can say I've worked on 14 affordable housing projects that have achieved LEED Platinum across the state of Idaho. So if you know that the people that need it the most have really low utility bills, that makes a difference. There's also now a program called LEED for Cities. So if a city wants to get certified, they can do that. You can get certified at Certified, Silver, Gold, and Platinum. Again, this LEED for Cities option. There's also a program out there that's been pretty widespread across the nation called Star Communities. I haven't really seen it locally, but if you're curious about a program that puts together a structure that goes beyond energy and really looks at all aspects of sustainability, this idea of Star Communities is an interesting one that you may want to pay attention to. It links a lot of things together. So there's a lot that cities can do, and hopefully I've recognized a few things that have been done locally that the community has done. What we can't do. If you followed the last legislative session, House Bill 547 was approved, removed the authority of cities to locally amend building codes. So all the effort that just went into Boise saying we're going to have better building codes and not be almost a decade behind, that power has now been stripped away. So I don't know what's going to happen with building codes. It does affect a lot of things like insurance ratings. It does affect our federal disaster relief funding. They put it in the Bipartisan Budget Act earlier this year that a certain portion of that funding is contingent upon you having the most current building codes. So if we have a major federal, disaster here that we're looking at having federal relief, we're going to lose out on part of that funding because we don't have up-to-date building codes. My brother-in-law is a Border Patrol agent, lives in Arizona. He was tasked with going to Houston and to the Florida Keys after the hurricanes hit in each of those places. He did a lot of his time in Black Hawk helicopters, lifting things down to pick up the people, lifting down another basket, picking up more people and rescuing them. He said it was unbelievable that you could literally walk through the Keys and say, built to a modern code? Not. Built to a modern code? Not. They were just flattened in between houses that were left fully standing. So paying attention to that for whatever code is going to be most applicable to the risks that you are encountering or that are possible, I think is critical in our day and age. Community solar. We were trying to get community solar going in Ketchum. Boise was trying to get a community solar project going, and we've now had the PUC change regulations so the fixed pricing that would cause an investor to commit to something like this went from 20 years to 2 years. So we then saw major developers like Solar City just turn their back on Idaho. So unfortunately, we're not seeing that opportunity currently available in Idaho. Although Idaho Power did introduce their own community solar program, I'll kind of leave it to all of you to make your own judgments of it. But it was an attempt to counter what the decision by the PUC was. But I think that's a dangerous thing for having a more sustainable future and a resilient future, to not consider the integration of some community solar projects in our communities. So I'll shift to a more positive note of success stories. Salt Lake City is doing awesome things. They're relying on, they want to have a goal of 50% renewable energy by 2020 in all their city operations. That's a lofty goal. You know what's happening? Renewable energy companies there have blossomed. Job growth has blossomed. And they're lowering their emissions and lowering their operating costs. Washington, D.C., I can't say enough about what I've seen Bill Updike do there. He's now moved on to private consulting, but it was really cool to see the initiatives that were happening there and some of the major projects that were going on. And they're looking at just saving significant money as well as carbon emissions with some of their major initiatives with renewable energy. All these cities are 100% renewable. Aspen, Colorado, Burlington. I'll give credit to Cambridge. They're moving that way. They're not quite there. Montpelier, Vermont. Lancaster, California, 50% renewable, but they're on a trajectory with projects approved to be 100% within 3 years. Georgetown, Texas is a fun one because it's a very Republican town that you wouldn't expect to be driving in this direction, and the mayor just looks at some of these TV interviewers and says, makes sense. Financially, smart governance, like why would I not do this? So I feel like I need to interview him in more detail. But so with that, I kind of kept it on a community level and tried to refer back to homes where I thought it was relevant on the initiatives that I see happening and the way that different communities are showing success, particularly in the energy direction, because I think that's the most important run right now, that we really address emissions. So if we don't address emissions, we've kind of lost the boat for some of the other efforts. But with that, I just want to open it up for discussion and talk about what we can do. Where are the opportunities of things that we could do here in this community? And I'll open it up to the entire state of Idaho. I lived in Boise for about 5 years, but I've been up in the Ketchum area for 7 years and consider Idaho my home and what I'm passionate about. So I would say questions, or start throwing out ideas for ways we can move towards a more sustainable future. Whether it's the rule of thumb that Curitiba, Brazil has to put libraries within walking distance of every child in a city. You know what that does for literacy? You know what it does for getting kids off the street and giving them something different to do? They may not have been big, beautiful, massive landmark libraries, but there's a library within walking distance or public transportation distance from every child. So just to whet your appetite, would love to hear ideas and have you inspire each other with different things that could be done in this community. Deanna?
Well, I have a question about my biggest grumpiness when it comes to how we build things, and that's houses that are too big. So I know that the state legislature, kind of put the kibosh on the energy code, but why are we still building houses with these huge, tall, peaked attics? And why are we, to me, I don't have near the level of knowledge you have, but some fundamental stuff that I know is not efficient. And I'll use my neighborhood as an example because we're also really annoyed with this because we live in the historic district and we're coming in and tearing down homes that are older, so maybe need work in terms of efficiencies. But they're smaller and they're modest, and so getting them there is easier. And they're putting in these massive things that don't add more people. They're still just 1, 2, 3, 4 people living in them. But they'll be like 3 times taller, and it's like all in the attic. Is there something a city could do to say, stop that?
Well, the city has done something, and so has the state. We did actually adopt a tiny house amendment for our building codes in the state of Idaho. So there are now standards in place for tiny houses, just for that reason, to say that, we have to have a diversity of housing options, and that's one way to do it. I argue this about energy codes all the time. A builder might say, well, it cost me $1,000 more to have a blower door test and to air seal and upgrade the furnace, or upgrade the windows, or whatever the efficiency upgrade is. I'm like, well, if you take 5 square feet out at $200 a square foot, there's your $1,000. Can we take 5 square feet out of the average home? And we're building larger than the average here.
Oh, yeah.
And you know what? We've got to start doing it right, because not only are we the fastest growing city in the nation at the moment, we have the second fastest residential construction market happening at the moment. Stuff is going up fast. They're fighting building codes so that it can go up fast and not to the standard it should be done at. I'm not sure I answered your question thoroughly, but I think tiny homes are a way of the future, and I think we've paved the way, much to the credit of Macy Miller and the work that she did to make that happen on a state level.
Well, I guess my real question was, outside of the energy code, what other codes do you recommend to cities, like height, for instance? I mean, if you can't do it through energy, one of the ways to get rid of these big, ridiculous attics is energy, but if you can't do it through energy, what are other code strategies for not allowing them? Are there any?
Put some incentive programs in place. Say you'll have a lower permit fee if you do below this type of square footage home, or if you do below this height. If we're not allowed to change code anymore, then that really stymies the opportunities in a lot of ways. But I think that you just think creatively about creating more of a carrot approach. And as a city, turn around and say, well, why don't we consider some incentives for a little bit smaller, or a little smaller yard, or a little more density, or whatever the strategy is that we feel like is going to have the best effect to resolve that. And a lot of times it's not even offering a big amount of money. A lot of cities are doing like faster permit time, but I think that if you just structure your permit amounts a little bit differently, that's a pretty big motivator.
Sharon, what about the, sometimes you hear about the conflict or a perceived conflict between historic preservation and efficiency?
Mm-hmm.
What can you say to that?
There's actually pretty significant conversations that happen between the U.S. Marine Building Council and, historic preservation councils at a national level. I think that we do the best we can to preserve any integrity that we can. But it's a challenge. What if you have a brick building that has no insulation on? I think you have to work on the inside and allow a little bit more flexibility to it. I don't want to see historic things go away, but I think there has to be an effort to make a compromise and say that maybe windows could be replaced, unless they're, stained glass windows that are significant for some reason, that we allow window replacement, or we allow or encourage greater air sealing, because that's our best return on investment. All we did was air seal our homes, which is minimal investment, that will have the biggest return. A lot of times you try to replace your windows and you're not going to see a great return on investment. You may see a little more comfort. You'll definitely get some energy efficiency improvements, but it's expensive to replace windows across an entire house. It's pretty minimal to do air sealing. And it's the unexpected things. You know, it's making sure you pull out the outlets and do a little foaming in there, the light switches, kickboards underneath cabinets, vents, ductwork, you know, just really working on that air sealing and making sure that it's sealed up really well so you don't have that infiltration. I say that on a home level, and I say that on a business level with some of the big buildings in downtown that we've been asked to analyze, and we say, you know what, get out a caulk gun, get your foam out. Don't look at replacing your chiller until you've done all the air sealing that you can do, and then run your analysis on what size of system you need. In the case of one major building downtown, we were able to drop the size of that chiller by 1/3 just by doing all that air sealing and making the building more efficient. So it's one of the things I would probably really rally hard on for new homes too. It's a national standard to do that level of air sealing and to require a blower door test. It's a job creation to have people out there doing blower door tests, which test the leakage of the whole envelope of the home. It's not in our code, wasn't adopted at a state level. And it's the biggest thing we can do from a return on investment standpoint and a envelope integrity level for future for homes. How often do you replace your walls? Once you seal them up, they're pretty set for a long time. Not to say your furnace isn't important, but I think the walls are the way to really focus attention at the start.
If our building codes are so far behind, which I noticed that when I moved to Idaho, it was pretty backwards. In the state, I work for the state, so if they can fall, I'm all for it. But why aren't they penalized for not meeting national standards and putting people at risk that if something happens, which very well could happen here, we all get penalized for something that's out of our control. So why aren't state officials getting penalized for not keeping up?
Interesting.
We have legislators that are against advancing our codes. We have one industry, residential builders, against it, and they're able to sway. We have a building code board that's actually voting to not move things forwards too.
But where do insurance companies stand on these kinds of issues? You would think it would be to their benefit to penalize communities or homes or structures that are not built to code.
So they'll focus a little bit more on things like structural code than they will on energy code if they're going to change their insurance ratings. But with that said, if you look at last winter here, did anybody have a problem with ice damming or know a neighbor that had problems with ice damming through this area? We can resolve a lot of that by better air sealing in attics, better insulation in attics, and really balancing the home better. And those are all in current national building standards. They're not standards here. So that's where we can see like an effect on, if we have enough ice damming claims across Boise, guess what happens to everybody's rates? Doesn't just go up for the one homeowner that had the problem. It starts to be, if it's a widespread problem, it shifts rates community-wide. So it does start to affect the whole community.
What about market incentives? Well, did any builder step up and say, hey, we are building to the latest and greatest codes, and did their business improve or not?
Well, I mean, I think the great example that we all like to refer to is Active West up in Coeur d'Alene, that they've been building LEED Platinum homes, and I'm going to get a little technical here, but if you were to go have a blower door test done, I don't have a picture of it here to show you what it looks like, but you essentially seal up maybe one opening and then you depressurize the home. And then you look at a reading to see at it's essentially like a 20-mile-per-hour wind hitting your house. And that's the level of depressurization. They're going to come up with a reading of how many air changes per hour are happening at that pressure differential. And right now our state code reads 7 air changes per hour at a 50 Pascal, which is that pressure differential. Current national code is down to 3. Best practice If you talk to EBA, which is Environmental and Energy and Environmental Building Alliance, most of their studies about durability show that 2 to 2.5 is the sweet spot for most ideal durability, not just energy efficiency, but prevent moisture intrusion, prevent pest intrusion. You know, if you really seal up a house so that spiders can't crawl in, that's a pretty nice perk, I think.
Spiders are good.
They're good outside. They can eat plenty of bugs out there. Let's keep the bugs outside. But yeah, that air sealing I think is really pretty critical. And from a market standpoint, you know, I mean, it's job creation. So if we could really recognize the builders around here that are willing to build to Energy Star, there are some of them. You know, there's groups like Scott Flynn Builders is doing quite a lot for zero energy homes and sustainable homes. You know, we have that one company up in Coeur d'Alene, and, you know, I don't want to go too far down the line of not naming or naming, you know, various builders around town, but absolutely, I think they should be getting more press, more coverage. Let's get newspaper articles about them.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk more about how like the LEED and energy efficiency can be affordable for like creating affordable housing, because I think a lot of times it's thought about as being very expensive to build green, but like if you can do it and still get a return for like, you know, affordable projects, there obviously are ways to do it affordably.
Yeah, at any point in time, all the residential LEED projects happening across the nation, it fluctuates between 30 to 50% of them are affordable, designated tax credit affordable housing. So a huge portion of LEED, you know, certification is going towards affordable housing. And it's doing it smartly. Like, I don't know how else to say it, because, you know, I've been brought in before with somebody saying, we're halfway done with construction, we'd like to make it LEED. And it's really hard to do at that point. Like, then you get change orders and you know, that's when your costs add up. If you put a little bit more into the design phase and really pay attention to doing smart design, you know, invest in the envelope, make sure that's solid, invest in the air sealing, you know, do the things that are smart investments for the future, you're not going to rack up huge expenses. Build 10 square feet smaller than average. You know, I would recommend like those sorts of approaches, and it makes it very affordable. If people do advanced framing technique, you know, it's common that the builders are going to do a 2x4. They've moved mostly to a 2x6 stud, but a lot of older homes are still a 2x4 smaller stud, which means you can't really fit as much insulation. You're probably only about an R13 insulation if you have a 2x4 wall. Whereas if you have a 2x6 wall, you can go up to more current standards of R19, R20, R21, or even more if you've got the most common practice I see in some of the better builders that are building sustainable and affordable is a skim coat of the expensive spray foam, just like an inch or two. Then fill in with the blown-in cellulose, which is a really sustainable, earth-friendly, low-impact product, but you're getting the air sealing out of that blown-in insulation, which is an actual air seal. So I think that's a best practice. The second best practice that I see that builders are swearing by that really are trying these things and trying to be progressive and more sustainable is to go with what's called a staggered stud wall. And so a staggered stud wall would be if you build and you can use a 2x4, you have one here, and then one here, and then one here, and then one here. So what it is your insulation can kind of weave through continuously. You no longer have that thermal break where each stud is. You've got continuous insulation flowing through your wall. So from a cost standpoint, just doing advanced framing and moving your wall studs from 12 inches apart to 24 inches apart will save about a third of the lumber costs for the framing that you're doing. So if you want to save a third on your framing, then put that money into maybe better windows. So I'd look at it more as a trade-off type situation than I would just adding things to try to make it green. So think practically about the approaches that really can trade off different efforts. Go for hard surface floors, better health quality. Don't spend a lot of money on the extra flooring. I know it looks beautiful, you know, and people want different flooring, but the simpler you go, sometimes the more affordable it is, and you can still achieve the goals.
Question about building codes some more. I think about Idaho Power, how they keep saying that energy efficiency is the most important thing to them because that means they don't have to build new power generation facilities. And I don't remember if Intermountain Gas said that. So are they at the table trying to help with building codes so that houses are more efficient?
So Idaho Power is always at the table, and I am going to give them credit that I think they do incredible things to foster efficiency in our community. And I would always tap into them. I like partnering with them. They have a lot of incentives that are worth paying attention to. There's a lot good there. On building codes, they take a neutral stance. So they won't sit at the table and take a strong yes or no. And I won't try to delve into what their political or rationale is for that. I just know they like to come to the table and listen, contribute information, and take a neutral stance. So there's a lot of major entities that do that. They come to the table and feel like it's important to keep a neutral stance. State agencies will do that too, which I respect that. You know, you don't want to be perceived if you're a neutral state agency as being real strong one direction or another on issues. So, yeah. So it's up more to private individuals. You know, it's up to businesses, it's up to citizens to go and have a say and write your legislators and tell them what you want. That's what makes a difference. I don't know whether I should pressure everyone into having a comment or a question if I've heard you be quiet or seen you be quiet.
So I have another one, it's more personal. I'm thinking about buying a house. I've been living in an apartment for a while, which is why I don't have solar panels, else I would. And so I'm interested in this idea of infill, but with these smaller homes, like the indie dwell idea and so forth. And I don't even know where I would begin. Like, could I literally walk up to somebody who has a giant lot, a house with a giant lot, and talk to them about parceling out their property? Do I go to the city for, I don't even know where to start. Is there a one-stop shop that can help with all these questions?
There's probably neighborhood association rules that would prohibit that. There's probably zoning rules by the city that would, and so I would start with neighborhood associations, and from there, a neighborhood association, you know, if it was something that seemed like a good thing for the neighborhood, then that's a much larger, louder voice to talk to a city or a community. So my suggestion would be to work through layers like that.
And by neighborhood association, you mean homeowners associations?
There's both. Sometimes it's a homeowner association with a particular home, you know, house development, and sometimes it's a larger, like a central district or a north end neighborhood association. So either level, I think is
But they don't have those kind of controls, the neighborhood association.
If there's no controls, then I don't know, approach the owner. I wouldn't do it without.
The owner.
Yeah, I wouldn't just make an agreement with the owner. There's always a risk that somewhere down the line, maybe, you know, some kind of jurisdiction could come back and say you're not allowed to be there. So I'd probably take the time to go through a more formal process just to be safe, unless you're okay with that risk. I mean, that's kind of I would consider it a risk if I plopped a house down and didn't have it really zoned that way. So
if you can find someone who's not in an HOA, who's interested and they're willing to build it as an ADU in Boise right now, the accessory dwelling units, Boise's recently changed, within the last couple of years, changed their ADUs to be very progressive. And they're really trying to encourage ADUs as frankly a form of infill.
And is that still then the other person's property? Like,
Yes, an ADU, it's their property. So it's almost like you're in a mobile home unit that's, you know, so you'd have to work that out because you wouldn't own the land.
Did they, when they changed the ADA rules, because that's like the perfect way to do it, if you were to put on like a tiny house that is on wheels, would that qualify as an ADU? Like, I'm not sure I know the way it came together and the wording of it well enough.
You know, I don't know, because I know they passed this new tiny house thing statewide. To my knowledge, the locals are still kind of struggling with the tiny house on wheels. And I think the state legislation helped them, but I don't know where Boise is on that.
Technically, state legislation did not address wheels at all.
Oh, okay.
It went to the first level, which is what the nation did. This was actually, Macy worked on a national, you know, nationwide amendment to codes. And the realistic thing to do was to address standards for stationary tiny homes first, with a full intention to bring that into wheeled ones as well, but it's not actually in the state code yet.
Yeah, ADUs don't apply in Boise or anywhere I know of in the state to wheels. They're permanent structures that are built on the ground.
You have to have a good relationship with the owner.
And so anywhere in the city, you can then have an ADU there, or there's zoning areas?
I mean, it's just, I can't answer that
Well,
specifically.
the percentage of the lots that, there are rules like that.
Right.
You can't, as long as there's room,
Right.
Okay,
then you can do it.
so I would ask the city
It's
for
just
that
a lot
information.
more, yeah, just go on the PDFs and they can tell you. You can do them like I said,
PDFs.
sorry, planning and development
You
services.
people with your.
I caught the other one. Planning and development services, just go to the city and ask them, but they just have a much more progressive, but no, it's not like just anybody can put them anywhere, but it's easier to put them in. It's easier to convert the upper story of your garage to one. I mean, people are doing interesting things with ADUs now that it's become, it used to be really hard, very difficult to put.
I also heard another elephant in the room is looping ACHD into this conversation, and I'm not going to profess to be an expert on the organization and how to loop them in, but I think engagement there and being a part of their planning process is a great opportunity, because I've heard developers complain about ACHD rules in terms of how that affects their cost to do more infill development and development of different areas. So, but again, I'm throwing out something for people to do without a concrete solution, so I don't know if that's super helpful.
On all these challenges that you've shown and all the cities that are participating, has Boise or anybody else in Idaho, for that matter, committed to meeting any of those challenges?
Mm-hmm. Boise Mayor signed on.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. He's one of the 400.
Okay.
So what about swimming pools? Do you have some ideas about swimming pools?
Heat pump heaters, always putting a cover on them. So there's a few things that can be done. We hesitate to say get rid of the pools. Like that chart that I showed you, that these community pools are beloved by the community, so we're not trying to get rid of them. But yeah, there's some system upgrades to just make. Mostly it's the heating that's just expensive, and the filtration.
When you were talking about it earlier, I started thinking about integration of wastewater treatment and swimming pools. Not the way you might be thinking, but
I know. Where are you going with this, Scott?
Wastewater sewage treatment does produce heat, and so that's probably your biggest expense in swimming pools, right? So there's free heat there if you can.
They've got some initiatives happening, like in Seattle, they're looking at some district heat type solutions.
Yeah.
I think at some stage in the future, that may be realistic. I'm not sure right now it's realistic that we're going to see these cross ownership lines, where one building's going to send their heat this way and one's going to send their cooling that way, and the infrastructure it takes. Is that where the future may go? I think that might be a great way to go. I'm not sure I see that as like our next step. There's still so many challenges with it, but the logic is beautiful. I think that's where we need to go.
Connected to that, I heard once a speech about that the future of energy is in really thinking locally and really thinking what are the resources in this area and how is the climate and how is the wind and all these things. What is in Boise? Is there something standing out that is specific in relation to energy? How we can best use it and bring it here and stuff?
We've kind of been pigeonholed into dealing with utilities, the way our public utilities have put the regulations in place, because we can't do community level renewable energy, not in traditional ways. But if a bunch of citizens got together and each privately owned and had a pretty big system for the neighborhood, there might be ways you can get around it. But I do think that, put that aside, let's just assume maybe someday that regulation is going to change. We saw big regulations get overturned in Nevada that people didn't expect to get overturned. So, and I don't think that's an impossibility. The progression that I've seen in the way that there's grid software to create microgrid solutions for communities is amazing. They had at the Sun Valley Forum last year some of the most progressive renewable energy software companies out there and some of the most progressive storage companies out there that were presenting and sharing information on that. And I'll give credit to the INL that they're doing some serious work on this idea of microgrids and how that could be a solution for the future. Shifting the massive dinosaur that is our existing utility grid infrastructure it's a big change. But there is so much happening out there. I mean, I just heard, I have to admit, I'm pretty loyal to the BBC. Hopefully nobody's offended that I walk away from American news and like to listen to that a fair amount. But they're just talking about there's now air storage for energy, and they've made it work in England. So is this our storage, potential for every situation? And they said no. For short-term storage, batteries still rule. But for long-term storage, this air storage is actually considered one of the most viable possibilities for the future. And there's air everywhere. I mean, they're doing storage in water, but you have to have the water nearby to do it, and that's not a solution for every location. So your big issues are integrating with grid infrastructure and storage. And so it's all local. If you have a stream, you can do micro hydro. If you have a lot of wind, you can do micro wind. If you do your own solar panels. So I think that looking at your diversity of what you can do on a very local level is critical, because that's where your opportunity is to capture it the best. But how that integrates into a larger grid is the challenge, and how you store it. Because if we generate more in the summer, but we need it more in the winter, how do we store it? So those are the big, global level debates that I'm hearing happening, is the storage and the grid integration.
So I'm curious if you have worked with or know of any co-housing developments that have been able to work from the ground up and do a lot of real innovative.
There was one here that was quite active for a while. Trying to think who. I wasn't involved. Like, since I've moved away from Boise, I don't tend to be involved in a lot of those initiatives. Were you familiar with it, Deanna?
Yeah, but I can't think of. There's a couple of co-housing efforts, conversations happening here locally.
But we haven't had anything actually on the ground yet, have we? We don't have any that exists.
There, I believe one does exist now. I don't know if in terms of actually physically existing, no. I think they're working towards that. But that's just a matter of getting land and deciding what to build and where to build and be involved. But there's no commercial, to my knowledge, there's no developers doing co-housing. The only co-housing efforts are individuals banding together and deciding to do co-housing.
But that seems like a really prime way of designing at least a small unit that would be really, really, really sustainable.
One of the really interesting, we don't call it co-housing, but it is, and I think Boise's not far away from this gentrification that's going on and the overbuilt homes. I read about this at work. I came across an article a few years ago. One of the things that's going on in San Francisco and has been for a while are these co-housing approaches where people are actually buying these huge homes, like $20 million homes. So these are not necessarily affordable. These are people who have a fair amount of money, but they don't want to own that big a home. They don't have that kind of money. And the story was really more about how people were using the internet. So there was this couple of realtors who were kind of promoting this idea, and people would develop a concept of the kind of co-housing they'd want, and they could use the internet to go find like-minded people. And there were a number of these homes that were getting built into completely different, and the homes are big enough that you can have your own space. Some of it's shared space, some of it's, and some of them, really wanted a very communal co-housing, others didn't at all. And so but you have to find the 10, 15 people who can all go in and buy this home, 20 people. In a couple of cases, they're as big as 20 people. I think that will be the co-housing in the future, is buying the big houses.
So you're saying already built houses and then converting them?
Yep.
I love the idea of the flexibility of construction. Like if you look at the Banner Bank building, one of the coolest things they did was modular wall systems. So if you have a tenant turnover in that building, they can turn it over in 1 to 2 days as opposed to 30 days because you're ripping out drywall and rewiring and all of that. So if I had my, fortune that I could invest and develop a business with, a lot of capital, I think I'd be developing modular type home systems so that, part of what causes a lot of movement right now is that, well, you start out as a single person, then maybe you become a partner, then maybe you have a kid, then maybe the kid moves out, then maybe the parents move in, or whatever your scenario is, or maybe there's more of a co-housing in the future. But if you have some flexibility in your design and you have a modular wall system, imagine what you could do by adding a bedroom and taking away a bedroom, adding an office, taking away an office, depending on the stage of life that you're at. And it may prevent a lot of the, well, we've got to move to a new house because it doesn't fit our needs anymore. So I don't know, I haven't gone there yet, but I love what Gary Christensen did in that building, and I've seen it happen in commercial and not enough in residential.
About a self-driving bedroom that you could dock with others.
Well, some of the self-driving cars are actually designed now in a way that they're like a box so that you can have like meetings in them. So like you can have like seats for 4 people facing each other and the car is just cruising to your destination, but the team is getting their work done on the way. I mean, it's not that different from a train. Imagine in Europe, you're moving between, city to city for some meetings and there's 4 of you that book a train ticket and you're in a seating arrangement where you're facing each other.
They are specifically for meetings. There are already this in trains in Europe. It's fun.
Maybe one day my dream will come true that there'll be a train between Boise and Ketchum.
Or up to Bogus, that we don't
that
have
would
all
be
these
great.
people every night going up and every night going down. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yes.
It's ridiculous.
Let's start with the airport. How's that? I think of all the cities I fly into to work, and they have wonderful public transportation systems to get from the airport to the core. And
Seattle.
Yep, Seattle's great, Portland's great. So we're just about out of time. Should we, one more?
So you're talking about co-housing, and there's a magazine called Yes, and they tend to do one topic per issue, and one of their most recent ones was on affordable housing, and at least one article was on co-housing. Community land trust, so not so much on energy use in building, but in terms of affordability and innovative ideas. I have a question about swimming pools. I was thinking about people owning their own swimming pools. Very expensive to maintain, but also insurance. You can't have foster children if you have a swimming pool, which is interesting. And so I was wondering, are cities trying to encourage more community pools and less private pools, like any sort of marketing campaign? And I assume that would save energy, one larger pool for every.
Seems like it. I'm not aware of any movement or policy in that direction, but I think it's a good idea. Who wants to maintain their own pool?
Exactly.
Just share everything.
Yeah.
My couple of neighbors who used to live really near us, we used to have this fantasy that if enough of us were like this on the block, that we can like kind of own and live in a historic East End. So a block just about the perfect size. It's 8 to 7 houses. And we used to think, we could just like rip out the backyards and inside. Here's the garden area, and we all have one garden, and one garden storage shed where all the tools are, and we just share them. We don't all, we talked about.
All need a lawnmower.
I wish we just owned one vacuum. We don't all need a vacuum sitting in our house. We just.
So we all need a guest room in our
Yeah,
house.
I guest room, so you could just have a whole guest house.
But seriously, so some of the co-housing discussions, I would just try Googling co-housing in Boise, because I know there's groups that are meeting. I'm not sure who to connect you to. But the concept is that you've got a large, like, big kitchen that's shared, but your smaller kitchen in your home. You've got a guest room in the shared, your own bedrooms in the home, the, utility closet and the garages where you need all the stuff is shared. And, it's a great concept if you can find agreement between everybody that's involved in it. I'm going to try to be conscious. We are right at 7:30, so if anybody has anything coming up or final thoughts or.
Thank you for reminding. I'd forgotten that buildings are such a giant use of energy. I do somehow in my brain always think of transportation first. And I do try to be very conscious of building energy, but it's just a great reminder and very depthy, and thank you for that.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the comment. Then I will wish everyone a lovely evening. I'm going to go get together with two of my girlfriends I don't see often enough, one of whom is Lori Chandro, who I'll give her a plug for her Tree Fort Music Festival she created. And my other girlfriend, Katie Babcock, they have tumble time and jump time around town, and it is way too seldom that I can sit and have a glass of wine with them. So I hope you have just as enjoyable an evening.
Thank you. I do have some question evaluations, so if you don't mind telling us that before you leave. If you have a few minutes.
Alex, I need to go. My husband